So again, my name is Nate Sheets, and I live in Oregon on the West Coast in the United States. And my experience that's related to our conversation tonight is that I was and am a foster and adoptive brother since I was 7 years old. And I've worked for the last 14, 15 years in the developmental disability field and the last 12 years as a behavior consultant. And most of my clients have some kind of developmental disability, and most of them are also either adopted or in foster care. I specialize in fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, but I have experience with all kinds of neurodivergence like autism, intellectual disability, and as well, mostly because of the foster and adoptive element of how I've started to work, a lot of experience in kids who have been through trauma and stress. I do have an upcoming book coming out, which if you're interested in my approach today, you might want to check out. You can keep an eye on my website, and the book will be called Essential FASD Supports. And I think for most parents who are here tonight, it will be helpful whether or not your child was exposed to alcohol or drugs prenatally. I do like to mention that I have a BA in business administration, so we'll be talking a lot about the brain tonight. However, most of my knowledge about the brain is self-taught, things that I've been learning. And as you will learn, and as you will see, I'm very much interested in the mechanics of thought. So while my education has not been on the brain formally, I definitely try to be correct and accurate in any assertion I make about how our brains work. So I'm always open to feedback about that. If you've had the schooling and and you have a correction for me, I'm happy to hear it. So my approach and how I approach my clients and how I approach the tough situations that we'll be talking about tonight is based mostly on that of cognitive skills and neuroscience. I'm really interested in how our brains work moment to moment and the mechanics of thought, not just in the tough situations that we'll be talking about tonight where there's escalation and dysregulation involved, but also just kind of in everyday boring moments that our brains are still being demanded to do things. And sometimes kids struggle with that, and there's a result, such as a behavior. I'm also interested in polyvagal theory, which I will bring up a little bit more later. I'm interested in executive functioning, which is a group of skills that are related to our cognition. And I'm also interested in neurodiversity and kind of the thinking and the writings that have been done about that in the last several years. And all of those inform the strategies and the suggestions and my outlook on supporting kids who sometimes get dysregulated. My start in all of this, including my start in my interest in neuroscience, started with Dr. Ross Greene, who wrote a book called The Explosive Child. And he has an approach called CPS, Collaborative and Proactive Solutions. And in this book, which is not one of his older books, he's written newer books since, but he says this, and it's something that really stuck with me and that had me dig deeper into the brain-based reasons of why somebody might be struggling with a challenging behavior. And so his quote is, "Your explanation guides your intervention." So your explanation of this behavior that you're seeing, of the screaming, of the kicking, of the pulling of the hair, the self-injury, will have an immediate impact on how you intervene, on how you respond, right? On how you approach this. And so when we as adults, when we have a kiddo who's especially dysregulated, if we are thinking that there's something intentional behind this, we will naturally move in a certain, what I would say is an unhelpful direction. So things like punishments, right? We'll try to punish and try to stop the behavior that we don't like. We'll try to reward. We'll have bribes of some kinds or sticker charts, and that doesn't work, at least not for the kids that are represented here tonight, because otherwise this training would not be necessary if either punishments or rewards worked. We'll often lecture, we'll talk to them about the behavior, we'll tell them for the 50th time why they shouldn't be doing what they should do. We'll go over yet again with them of what they can do the next time. We'll ask them questions that are not helpful. One of the top being, why did you do that? You know, why did you hit your sister? Why did you feel the need to scream at me? And those questions are unhelpful because the kiddos are not, they're going to be looking at the surface level, much like the adults are. They're going to give you the thing that maybe triggered the escalation, but they're not going to dig deep in the way that we're digging deeper tonight to have a different understanding of what is causing the big dysregulated feelings and therefore the behavior. So that dysregulation in most situations comes before the behaviors. And as adults and systems continue to essentially take an intentional approach or put most of the effort on the kid, the responses tend to get more severe, but are usually just as unhelpful. So they start to get suspended, maybe from school, maybe from activities. They start to get displaced, maybe from foster home to foster home. They might even be involved in the justice system, be arrested, you know, kind of with that lens. What we'll be doing tonight is understanding this idea that a lot of challenging behaviors occur when we are expecting a child to do something that their brain just can't do. It is we have an unreasonable skill expectation. So for example, if I sit my kid down at the end of the day and have them do 20 minutes of homework, that demands a lot of skills. One of those skills is attention span. So if they have to sit down and do 20 minutes of homework, they need to have 20 minutes of attention span to be able to focus on that homework. And, you know, that's just an unreasonable expectation for most of my clients with prenatal alcohol exposure. It's also an unreasonable expectation for most kids if it's like the end of the day, if it's been a rough day. There's a lot of factors that make it unreasonable. But in other words, if the kid doesn't have the attention span, there's going to be a dysregulated response. And that's just one thing that might create dysregulation, is the skills thing. We'll talk about other things as well. So when we have that understanding that, okay, I'm seeing a challenging behavior right now, but this is a skill issue, even though it might look intentional from the surface, and given our traditional views of behavior, there is a skill issue going on right now. And when we start to take that approach and have those responses, it allows us to go in a different direction that I think is ultimately more helpful. So for example, we can be more proactive. If I'm seeing a struggle right now, because I know my kid struggles with their attention span, or their impulse control, or their ability to transition from one thing to another, or their emotional regulation, all of those things, then I know that that's probably going to be an issue tomorrow. And it's probably going to be an issue next week and next month, meaning that I have to handle whatever situation I have as it comes up, but I can be consistently asking my child's team to be proactive about these supports and adjust things to where the child is actually at, and to make those cognitive skill demands through our expectations and interactions more reasonable. And so we'll move it more into a state of accommodation rather than continually expecting them to do things that they simply can't do and then having reactions to that. We're able to think differently if we start to understand. Ultimately, the big idea is when your kid is dysregulated and having a behavior, they don't have direct control over it, right? And it's nuanced. There's more to it than that. But ultimately, if they are in a dysregulated state, their brain is going into or is already in a fight or flight, or maybe frozen responsive defensive state. And so we can think differently about that and maybe have a little bit more compassion and understanding, and again, be proactive for the next time. So we can empathize. We can ask ourselves, if I couldn't process verbal language in real time, the way my child can't, how would that impact my life? How might people judge me and respond to me? How would I deal with the expectations that I encounter every day that are mostly verbal, right? Same thing, you can essentially swap that out with any cognitive skill like attention span, impulse control, and the list goes on. So there's a lot of different approaches that we're going to naturally start to take when we remember that this is likely not an issue of a child being intentional and manipulative, but rather an issue of skills and the demands of life, and sometimes of the demands of a neurotypical society if they're neurodivergent. So when we reframe challenging behaviors this way, it makes things easier on us emotionally, which is helpful, even if it's just a little bit, because we're starting to understand things a little bit different. It allows us to problem solve these issues, preferably ahead of time, because proactive is always better than reactive in the moment responding. And eventually, once our child is both developmentally ready and willing to have these conversations, we can help them start to understand what's going on. So that we can go beyond the labels of emotion and the kiddo who themselves thinks, I'm mad, I'm frustrated, right? Those words that we've given them, to understanding on some level, at whatever is appropriate, that I struggle with impulse control. Right? I struggle with moving before I think. I struggle with problem solving quickly. So I need to take some time to think. And so with understanding comes some coping skills or things that they can do or advocate for themselves as they live their daily lives. And I'm going to argue that the cognitive understanding of what is going on, in addition to other brain-based and body-based understandings, is more accurate than most of our gut feelings. When we're in our everyday life dealing with a kid who's having some kind of response to us, who's being oppositional, who is escalated, the gut feelings we have tend to be very simplified and not really assuming the best about the child. And so with this approach, we're actually able to do that. So I'm asking you to go from a traditional frame of mind that most of us were raised with, or most of us absorbed as we grew up, and have a lens change to what we call the can't versus won't. So with traditional views of behaviors, we might think that children will learn acceptable behaviors when their good behavior is reinforced or when their bad behavior is punished. And so this comes from behaviorism, which is a part of psychology, and it is very simplified, it is very misused, and it is very much a small part of the picture, when really we need to be looking at many other things other than reinforcement and punishment. Traditional views of behavior will assert that when a child or teenager is refusing to do something, it's because they want to get in control, be in control, or they want something and they just want to get it. So we have kind of these very simple, they just want attention, they want to be in control, they're manipulative, these little explanations, and we kind of leave it there and put it on the child to then change. Traditional views of behavior might say that when children or teens have a bad behavior, it's a reflection of their character. So we start to call kids things like jerks, they're spoiled, they have an anger problem, or we start to blame their parents' parenting abilities, which I'm sure many of you here tonight have had people tell you directly or insinuate that maybe the issue is you. Maybe if you had better boundaries, that this wouldn't be happening. Maybe if you punished them more, maybe if you didn't let them spend so much time on video games, maybe if you let them spend more time on video games, right? All of the advice, it can vary a lot. And none of these things, in my opinion, really get at the heart of what we're talking about. So instead of the traditional, we're taking the can't versus won't mentality. On the surface, it looks like a won't. We see a child refusing. We ask a question, they escalate or refuse to answer. So it looks like a won't, but really, again, because what we might be demanding is unreasonable, the issue is that they can't in that moment. So so-called challenging behaviors happen when someone is expected to use cognitive skills that they either do not have because they have not developed it yet, maybe they're neurodivergent, or they're young, or that they just can't access right now, because it's very true that our brains do things differently on some days than others, or that other things block it, excuse me, or that other things block it. So if we have a kiddo who's been through trauma, even early trauma that's been years, when they get into a certain state of dysregulation, whatever cognitive skills they have will immediately drop, making them less equipped to handle certain situations that demand quick thought and adaptability and flexibility and regulation. So generally speaking, we're going to assume that children and teens want to be successful, but they need supports to do so in a society that ultimately misunderstands them. And the misunderstanding, is especially relevant to neurodivergent kids, but I would say even kids who've been through trauma who don't show other signs of being neurodivergent, if they are constantly under pressure because of their behaviors, that is a type of misunderstanding. And so skills, or what we think of as skills or improvements, will be learned when the expectations, when the interactions, and when the situations we put these kids in are more appropriately supported. Now, it takes time to figure that out. It's not like there's like just simple things you do and everything's perfect, but it's about switching your mindset and moving in a more helpful direction. So if we look at traditional strategies, we'll start, and cognitive skills, we'll start to see why maybe they are not very effective. And this is especially true, again, for somebody who's either been through a lot of trauma, has some developmental delay, or who's neurodivergent. They have a diagnosis or suspicion of a diagnosis of some kind of developmental disability, like autism, like fetal alcohol, intellectual disabilities, etc. So let's consider from the cognitive perspective mostly what we do, which is there's a behavior, and so we have a talk with the kid. We have a verbal conversation. The verbal is important here. And we make some kind of plan with them, and they agree to it, right? That the things that they could do the next time, they should take deep breaths, they should go draw in their room, right? But then it doesn't happen. So why might it not happen from the cognitive perspective? Well, if it's verbal and we just talk about it and there's no visualization, then it is by nature of that abstract. So it might be too abstract. And also, if we're talking about things that haven't happened, it's hypothetical. That might be also a little bit too abstract. Maybe the kiddo doesn't understand all that's being said because we as the adult are using a lot of words, which a lot of us are prone to do. So we're actually overloading them with language and they're not processing all that's being said. It's not that they're processing none of what's being said. They're picking up on stuff, and they may not even realize, a lot of kids, that they're missing a significant amount of information. But that can happen. Maybe they have memory distortions because of their overall executive functioning issues, or maybe because of other things deeper in the brain, in their memory. They don't remember the conversation that we had accurately, so they don't follow it. And the question ultimately is, does this conversation I'm having with them right now do anything for them 2 days from now in the heat of the moment when they're getting escalated? Is their brain even thinking about this conversation? And of course, the answer is probably no, because dysregulation shuts down your ability to stop and think about what's going on. And so it takes time to work through that. And so the danger of this is that we have all these conversations, we make all these agreements that don't get followed up or don't get followed through on, and lack of success with this. So the fact that this doesn't seem to work can very easily be interpreted as lack of compliance by the adults in the situation. Sometimes adults, maybe parents, maybe teachers, maybe therapists, will have the kiddo sign some kind of contract, right? Where maybe we list out the things we don't want to see anymore. Maybe we list the things that we do want to see, but the contract, maybe it's helpful for a while, but ultimately it's unsuccessful. So my question would be, does the contract that you're having them sign really consider why a behavior is happening? Almost certainly not. That contract is not going to provide emotional regulation to your child when they're triggered a couple hours, a couple days from now, right? It's not going to give them the skills that they need in a moment that too much is being expected of them, or when there's an unreasonable cognitive expectation. In other words, these contracts are usually a formalized visual, but formalized way of us telling the kiddo, you need to try harder. You need to stop doing this. You need to start doing this. Best of luck to you. And the danger with that is that lack of success can be easily interpreted by the adults in the situation as lack of compliance. Then we have the rewards, the bribes, the point systems. Those are also confusing because the kiddo often wants the incentive that we're offering, whatever it is. And so they're often enthusiastic to do well. And so what we as the adults see, when we see enthusiasm, we think, they're motivated. And to most adults, they think that motivation is the answer here. That's what a lot of the questions I get are framed around. How do I motivate this kid? Motivation is a very small part of the overall situation. Motivation now does not equal cognitive skill availability later by any means, right? And so again, does the system, the point system, the sticker chart, whatever, does it do anything to help the kiddo in the moment? Now, I'm not like 100% against it, but within the support, we have to have in the moment cognitive supports, not just some kind of, carrot on a stick or some kind of incentive. We also know that for the general population, long-term incentives don't work. I know that if I went to the gym every single day, I would be hot, right? Like I would have a banging bod, but it doesn't work that way. It doesn't, that knowledge, the long-term incentive of what my body could look like and how strong I would be, does nothing for my day-to-day abilities to actually motivate myself and then initiate and then transition and regulate all of the little tiny steps it takes to get up from my bed and into the gym and to sustain a workout and all of that kind of thing. So long-term incentives really don't work for the general population in most situations. And so we should not expect them to work for most kids who've been through trauma or who are neurodivergent. And again, lack of success with these systems can be interpreted as lack of compliance. So my overall approach is called cognitive supports. And the cognitive supports, there are specific things that we do, but the most important thing is that we're doing something with the brain, with a specific cognitive skill in mind. So if for example, I will a lot be encouraging you to give your kid time to think, especially when they're escalated, rather than engaging with them. So the idea is that when I'm giving my kid time to think, part of my brain is saying I'm doing this because of their impulse control right now, or because they're dysregulated, or because they don't need me to be distracting them while they're thinking, right? So you're doing something, giving time to think, offering a visual with a specific cognitive skill in mind. And there are different phases to this, which we won't go too much in depth right now, but there's an understanding phase, and this is for the adults, understanding cognitive skills, the brain, what's going on in my kid, how can I reinterpret these behaviors? So we're changing our lens. Then we want to learn how to get better at thinking ahead so that we can provide support or we can avoid certain situations, be proactive, in other words. We want to do a lot of adjusting expectations, which I'm sure many of you are already doing a lot of. And we want to be okay with adjusting expectations. We don't want the pressures of the traditional world and the neurotypical society to make us feel like the fact that we're adjusting is the wrong thing to do. I can assure you it is the right thing to do for these kids. And what adjusting expectations often means is that we let a lot of things go, a lot of rude remarks, a lot of challenging behaviors. We don't even have to address a lot of them for some kids because they're having 20 of those a day and we can't sit there and rehash. And so even though we might want to rehash or have some kind of conversation because we think we have to wrap the situation up with a bow for the kid, we don't have to do that. We can let it go and save those conversations for a good time and when they might be helpful. We also need to learn how to shift our approach. So our literal approach and interactions with the kiddo, if they've been through trauma, for example, I have to speak with a higher voice prosody. I have to speak slower. I have to use maybe fewer words. So all of these adjustments that I need to be making in order to maintain regulation with the kid I'm interacting with would be an example of shifting the approach. Then there's also the physical environment. Are there noises like a buzzing microphone apparently? Are the lights too bright? All of those things are very applicable for kids who are easily dysregulated. So that sensory element of the environment in particular. And we can do all four of these for a substantial amount of time. And the goal is that eventually when the child is developmentally ready and when they're willing, that we start to collaborate and make plans with them. So actually getting them on board with what are some things you can do when you get upset. Like those are things that we definitely want to work on with the kiddo, but we have to wait until we've established success with these other phases. And again, where the kiddo has the skills to do it. So a 4-year-old, wouldn't be able to have a very advanced plan. You can do some things, but not something that you might be able to do with a 13-year-old or a 16-year-old. And they also have to be willing. So if I if I meet with my kid, they're very regulated, I'm regulated, and I bring up, hey, can we talk about this? And they give me an immediate oppositional or maybe even a dysregulated, no, I don't want to talk about it. That's a sign that now is not a good time to talk about it. So that's what I mean by willing. We have to, for some kids, not everybody, but for some kids, we have to address why are they continually resistant? And that is very much related to a lot of what we're talking about. So cognitive supports comes from, or is inspired by 3 major areas. I already mentioned the explosive child, and this gave me this understanding that behaviors are the result of so-called lagging skills, or us expecting kids to use skills that they don't have or cannot access. And it's also what kind of triggered me to learn about all of the individual cognitive skills. And it also, the big point that the book is trying to help parents with is that collaboration piece. But again, we have to wait until the child is developmentally able to collaborate. And that's a big part of what I'm helping the families that I work with do. There's also a term called the neurobehavioral model, and this is applicable to all types of neurodivergence, and I apply it to fetal alcohol because that's what I specialize in. But this is the idea that understanding that different brains have different abilities, and when you have a disability, then we cannot continue to have typical expectations of a child, right? But we often do, and so you already have the obvious adjustments you've made, but there are likely adjustments you haven't made because they're just kind of how you think things should be. And so those are the things that we have to continually ask. Is this a reasonable expectation, or is the way that I'm expecting it reasonable for my child? And I mean, to me, it's kind of clear that if you're not seeing success with your expectations, there's something about it that likely needs to be changed beyond the kiddo needs to try harder and just do what they're told. So it's okay, again, to adjust those expectations. The other big part, a discipline within neuroscience that I'm interested in, and that will definitely be informing pretty much everything that I'm talking about tonight, is polyvagal theory, which was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, and is described very well in this book called Beyond Behaviors. If you haven't read Beyond Behaviors, it's the #1 book I recommend to families and professionals to understand the concepts that we're talking about tonight. So because the kids that we're talking about tonight are adopted or maybe in foster care, the factor of stress and trauma is very, very real. And it's important that the adults understand that the concept that kids are resilient, maybe you've heard that kids are resilient. No, humans from early ages are not very resilient. And when you've had stress in the early time of life, there's a good chance that you're struggling later in life, especially when we think about all of the things that are going on and the re-trauma that can happen with a lot of these kids. So definitely recommend Dr. Mona Delahunt. Just to review really quick, I like how I view behavior. So when parents are describing some incident to me or a situation, I'm running it through what I call a cognitive skills filter. And so I'm asking, what list of cognitive ingredients are we expecting of this kid, of this neurodivergent kid, of this kid who's obviously been through something, of this 3-year-old, right? Whatever it might be. And so it's literally like a recipe card, right? Like you would have if you were cooking something. So we have our overall expectation. Let's do the second graphic here. 5 minutes of homework, right? We might as parents say, okay, it's just 5 minutes, just sit down at the table and do 5 minutes of homework. Okay, I've adjusted that expectation. It's not 20 minutes, it's 5 minutes. It should be doable. Well, maybe it is doable for a lot of kids, but what is true is that if the child is to be successful with the expectation, so actually sitting down and engaging with 5 minutes of homework, moment after moment after moment, millisecond by millisecond, their brain is having to access certain skills. in particular, attention span. So I need to have my attention span controlled onto the worksheet or whatever I'm working on. I need to be able to resist distractions. Distraction can be outside sensory input or distracting thoughts. Also with impulses. If I'm an impulsive kid by nature, I might need to resist impulsive actions lest they become a distraction, or again, impulsive thoughts. I need to self-monitor, which is a subtype of attention. So if I'm writing something down and I make a mistake, does my brain catch it and immediately make a correction without getting distracted or without getting overwhelmed? I need to shift from one thing to another, most likely one question to another, one problem to another, and the list goes on. Every waking moment essentially demands a list of cognitive ingredients. And for us as adults, we don't necessarily recognize that. Something like having a friend over, if it's a friend that we like, it's so easy for us that there is no sense of demand, right? It just feels like we're living life, but we are being demanded to do things even in those easy moments. It's just that, again, we have developed adult skills, or the task is just a really good match for us. So when we use this cognitive skills filter, we can reframe a lot of our terms or interpretations of why a behavior is happening. So, I might have a mom tell me, like, I'm trying to get some work done, but my daughter keeps coming into the room and interrupting me because she wants my attention, right? Attention is a very big go-to interpretation. It's one that we should put on the back burner. It's important, but it's also not necessarily the first thing that's going on. Well, if we're looking at just the cognitive picture alone, does this child have the attention span that is long enough to self-entertain, right? Because we need her to self-entertain in that room so we can do our thing in this room. And so the pressure gets put on the kid and the frustration comes out if she doesn't have that attention span in the first place. He won't keep his hands to himself. Maybe, but maybe his body is dysregulated. She lies because it causes drama and she likes drama, those kinds of things. Maybe her brain misremembers or confabulates details. And so when she says these things, people have dramatic reactions, but it's not necessarily intentional. That's that's specific to fetal alcohol. We'll start to use labels like he's such a jerk, right? Or he's spoiled. He's rude, those kinds of things, but maybe his brain can't regulate stress right now. So this isn't about me. And that's a big thing that we have to remember about what we're talking about tonight. When our kiddo is escalated toward us, it's going to seem like it's all because we just told them no, or we told them to get off the video games. But if they have a history of this, which I'm assuming is the case for most of us, it is less about the trigger, the immediate thing that kind of provoked it, and all about this underlying dysregulation that this kiddo is having to live with and regulate day after day, and which they successfully in a lot of cases actually do. We don't see all of the successful regulation going on because it's internal, right? But they might be resisting a lot of things and doing pretty well until we get to maybe a certain point of the day, or very specific triggers, or maybe certain situations that kind of trigger a pattern of reaction, not just in them, but in us. So we get into the back and forths, we get into arguments and those kinds of things. Another example, they just don't want to do their schoolwork. They don't like school. Well, maybe their executive functioning fuel is out right now. So executive functioning fuel, which applies to everybody, is essentially this idea that for most people, the more you use your brain, your executive functioning skills, your attention span, your impulse control, your distraction resistance, those kinds of things, your willpower, that dissipates throughout the day, and it gets refreshed when we go to sleep. And so if we're asking kids to do tough mental work at the end of the day, then we're going to be more likely to see dysregulation. So we can see that, such as the case with trying to do homework in the evenings, but we also might see, every night when we try to start the bedtime routine, because in order to do the bedtime routine successfully, there's a lot of work, including regulation and then all of the little steps that I'm supposed to do as a kid to get into the nighttime routine. And maybe I don't want to go to bed right now. Maybe, so all of those are playing a role in why you might get some predictable responses. So we're really focusing on the little moments, and there are benefits when we're looking at a little moment. And there are drawbacks if we don't. If we're just focused on the overall behavior, he needs to stop being so angry. He needs to keep his hands to himself. If we're not focused on the little moments of what is being demanded of the brain, we're probably going to run into some things. So when we can focus on little moments, it helps us to understand what they're going through. It helps us to think practically about how to continue to address this or prevent it in the future. We can take a problem-solving angle, right? Because if we're looking at skills like impulse control, we're not going to fix that overnight. So we need to do some problem solving and start to explore, how do I support this kid's impulse control proactively, and eventually include the kiddo in that, again, when they're developmentally ready and willing. We can try many different supports, and we don't expect the supports to really work right away, first of all, and we don't worry about some supports failing, because we're trying many different things. So we can really be curious about what's going on, and we can remember that this is a brain thing, not the person being a little brat or a little jerk. When we don't focus on the little moments, it's very easy for us to continue to hold the person to expectations that they simply cannot meet. And then we blame them for failing to meet our unreasonable expectations. Us being parent, us being professional, us being the system, any of those. As time goes on and we have more and more clashes or more situations of co-dysregulation, of arguing, of power struggle, for a lot of kids, we will start to get into what I call a negative interaction pattern. That's when you're both going back and forth, and it's almost like a script, or like it's being pulled out of you. You don't even have to fully focus, because it's almost so predictable of their response and your response and their response and your response. And, it just keeps things escalated. So we want to definitely avoid that situation. Or if we're already there, which some of us might be, we have to take some big steps to circumvent those automatic kind of back and forths. And when we don't focus on the little moments, we're looking for solutions that don't actually solve the in the moment cognitive struggles. So I wanted to talk to you, that was kind of my cognitive introduction, which I still think is very important, but we're also talking about this concept of regulation and dysregulation, and that goes deeper than cognitive skills. The cognitive skills like attention span, impulse control, distraction resistance, on some level, this isn't really accurate, but we can think of it as being kind of at the surface of our brain. They're newer skills that evolved. They're the last skills to fully develop, but regulation is deep within the brain. Some of the earliest structures to have evolved, and some of the earliest structures that are ready to go as soon as we are born, even before we're born, our brain is picking up on what is stressful and what is not stressful. So we want to remember that everyone's brain, including our own, because all of this is also applicable to us as the adults, we learn, we react, or we respond to situations, to stressors, to whatever, in very small time frames. And it only takes a moment for something to become too stressful or too demanding on the brain, especially if this has happened a lot in the past. So a kid who's been stressed out for a lot of their life, through no reason, through no fault of their own, they are going to become more sensitive to stress essentially as they get older. And over time, this leads to resistance and what we call unsafe neuroception. So we're going to talk about regulation and dysregulation, whether or not we're regulated or whether or not we are dysregulated, and fight or flight and all of that. And then we're going to talk about this concept called unsafe neuroception, which is very likely to be applicable to the kids that we're talking about tonight and thinking about tonight. So it's kind of a subcategory of all of this, but it's important that we talk about it. And then we're going to end the training talking about some specific strategies that you can use during escalation. And you might use a lot of them already. the idea, I don't want anybody to think that you're going to go and do a lot of these and you're going to see immediate success. But the idea is, do we have a framework in mind that makes things a little bit better, especially during escalation and dysregulation, versus are we allowing ourselves to be swept up? Are we reverting to unhealthy responses that are making things worse and setting things up to be even harder the more and more they happen as the kiddo gets older? Again, I just want to point out the resource of Dr. Mona Delahook. Her book is Beyond Behaviors. She's actually also written a book recently called Brain Body Parenting, which I'm still working through, but it's very, very good and along the same lines of what we're talking about today. So let's talk about regulation. I'm going to give a list of what it will look like when we or our child are regulated. There's always exceptions though, just so you know. So for example, one of them will be eye contact. When a kiddo is regulated with you, they're going to be looking you in the eyes. That is true much of the time, but there are times when a kiddo might be regulated, but for whatever reason, they don't look you in the eyes. That could be a them thing, or it could be part of their neurodivergence. So an autistic kiddo, they might be very regulated and warm and doing great, but they just don't look anybody in the eyes really at all. So that one thing, the fact that they're not looking us in the eyes, does not necessarily mean that they're dysregulated, right? So I just want to throw that out there. These are general lists and things that we want to be aware of within ourselves as well as in our kid. So when we are regulated, this is part of polyvagal theory. We have a nerve that stretches through a lot of our body called the vagus nerve, and there is activating different parts of our body when we are both regulated and dysregulated. So it's been around for a long time, and it helps with survival and to trigger our brain and body into certain survival states. So the newest system to have evolved, so the newest ability on this level is to be regulated. Regulation is not the default. The default is frozen or fight or flight. You know, animals or whatever who are aware of all of these dangers and constantly on edge. Our ability to be at ease as humans has taken a long time to evolve. And we call this the ventral vagal system, or what Dr. Delahook calls the green pathway. So I'll mention the green pathway. When I say that, I mean when we are regulated. The part of the vagus nerve that is applicable to the green pathway is above the diaphragm. It involves our heart rate, our lungs, our pharynx, and our larynx. So how we speak, our voice intonations are very much impacted by it. When we're on the green pathway, so when our brain is sensing safety and we're on the green pathway, this is when we're able to co-regulate, and also when we're able to self-regulate. We're more easily able to self-regulate. We cannot co-regulate with a child if we as the adult are not on the green pathway. And that's hard because a lot of times their behaviors, even if we know like this child is safe, you know, I'm not in any real danger, are parts of our brain, such as our vagus nerve responses, they are triggered outside of our direct control, right? And so one part of our brain, our executive functioning, might know that this kiddo is safe to me, but other parts of our brain don't know that. And that is why we can get escalated when our kiddo starts to get escalated. Our brains are picking up that information and adjusting to try to help us survive. And so that's why we want to be aware of what's going on in my body, both when I'm in a state of regulation and outside of that state, so that we can quickly self-regulate or at least get on that path and then move to help our kiddo co-regulate more effectively. When we're on the green pathway, we will seek out and offer support to others. Because we can access more of our cognitive skills, we are resourced and resourceful, so we're able to think things through a little bit better. And these are the, you know, we're very sensitive as humans and triggered onto the green or off of the green pathway through things like facial expressions, other people's eye contact, certain frequencies of tone, especially kids, vocalizing. Our swallowing reflex is impacted by what pathway we're on. How we're breathing is impacted by that. When we're on the green pathway, it supports social engagement and connection under the condition of safety. So as long as there's nothing telling our brain in that moment there's something unsafe, we're good to go. We can socially engage. So this pathway is thought to have evolved to help with social engagement and cooperation and interaction, which then helped with executive functioning development. When kids are on the green pathway, they're able to learn much more effectively. They're able to play. The signs that a child is on the green pathway is their eyes will be bright, they'll be engaged, they'll be shiny, they'll be alert and responsive. If there's a noise over there, they might look over there, but they're attending to what's going on around them. Their body, again, there might be some exceptions due to motor issues or medical issues or neurodivergence, but generally speaking, the body will be relaxed and be stable. They'll be balanced and alert to the environment. They'll be smiley with us or neutral. Green pathway doesn't necessarily mean happy. It doesn't even necessarily mean calm, actually, but it means internally regulated and able to use more resources to stay regulated. But, if you're having a nice, warm, co-regulated moment, you'll probably see a smile and show a range of emotions as appropriate. They'll be inclined to laugh, and their voice tone will change. Kind of, again, with whatever's going on, we'll have a more expressive voice tone, unless there's something in the person's brain that prevents that. But that's what we're going to expect to see. And when they move, we're not going to see too quick movements and not movements that are very slow. So then we have the red pathway. So this is the second oldest system. So the ventral vagal, the green pathway, is the newest system. So the second newest is the red pathway. And we call this the sympathetic nervous system. And this also helps to regulate our hearts and lungs. So this is not necessarily part of the vagus nerve, but it impacts the vagus nerve. And so the green pathway has us breathe a certain way and have a heart rate a certain way. But when the red pathway is triggered or activated, it will change the way those things go. So we know, like, your heart, if you're on a fight or flight, which is what this is, fight or flight, you're going in that direction, your heart will tend to beat harder, right? You'll tend to take deeper breaths or maybe shallow breaths, depending on if you're in fight or flight. So this is a system that originates in our spinal cord and works with the green pathway to bring needed energy to navigate daily activities. So yeah, like when it is kind of constantly going back and forth with the green pathway and the red pathway to manage some of our internal body systems. When it is triggered, it is a mobilization. So when I start to go into fight or flight, either of those, my brain is trying to mobilize my entire body. So it's sending things through my whole body to get me to survive, even if that survival is an argument, right? There might be something going on that triggers that. When we are on this, there's different phases. We're not like triggered onto the red pathway and then instantly throwing fists. There's definitely a process that is going on a lot of the time. And when we start to feel this way, we're going to feel out of sync with others, right? Maybe you felt anxious recently at a gathering of people. When your brain is trying to put you into a fight or flight mode or fighting it, you're not in the social engagement category anymore. And so then it makes you actually feel disconnected with people. We're often driven to get our needs met, whatever we perceive our needs needing to be. We'll be alarmed, anxious, hypervigilant, more likely to misread cues, especially social cues, and will, quote, sacrifice social engagement for survival. So when I am triggered onto the red pathway, this is true for me. I can be a sassy person. I care less about, and not even care less, but the priorities in my brain of being kind, being calm, being warm, go out the window, right? I start I'm driven to survive. I'm driven to get my needs met in that situation. So again, when you hear the term fight or flight, that is on a neuroscientific level talking about the sympathetic nervous system. In addition to fight or flight, this is where a lot of opposition is, pretty much in the red pathway. When somebody is going on this pathway, we'll see that their face gets wide, it kind of gets big. Their mouth will be sometimes open, you know, and you'll see like clear signs of aggression or a more aggressive stance. Or they might be clenching or faking a smile, like in the lower levels of it as we're trying to adapt. But there's a level of rigidity and tenseness there, which we as the adults need to be aware of, both within ourselves, as well as, are we even aware of this in our kid? Or are we just so focused on what they're saying or the surface level behavior that we're not noticing the body language? So we want to just put a lot of effort in that for a while so we can become more attuned to the earlier signs, especially of red pathway activation. These will seem contradictory to some degree, but I think the idea here is that the eyes are not relaxed. They are either wide open and aggressive. They might be squinted and glaring. They might be closed in some situations, kind of depending on the situation and the kid. Eye contact will either be very intense. If somebody's looking at you aggressively, they're actually holding eye contact, or they might be darting around the room, which is more of a sign of maybe the flight response starting. Body language will tend to be stiff. So fingers might be spread out, the arched back, constant movement, maybe hitting or bumping into things as they're moving from place to place. They might push things around. They might invade other people's space. In the context of being tense, they might have, or their voice tone will change. So it tends to go higher when we're in fight or flight, higher pitched yelling. They might be loud, hostile, laughing, and their body movements will tend to be fast. Most situations I'm dealing with, most kids deal with the red pathway. Most adults deal with the red pathway. Many people also deal with the blue pathway. So this is the oldest part of the vagus nerve activation. And we call this the dorsal vagal. And this is what we think of as frozen. And this part of the vagus nerve is connected with the stomach, liver, the digestive stuff, spleen, kidney, colon, and intestines. And when in survival mode, beyond fight or flight, so when the brain determines fight or flight is not going to help me survive right now, then it goes into a conservation mode. This is the spaciness, the frozenness, not a kid who's glaring and refusing to move and folding their arms and, you know, frozen that way. That's the red pathway, right? This is somebody who is disconnected with the moment and with other people. So it creates that sense of disconnection. It's something that numbs us. And a lot of you as parents deal with this as well, by the way. You know, sometimes we seek things that actually activate the blue pathway. If you're scrolling on your phone just to get a break, which I'm not judging you for by any means, but you start to feel that numbness, that's actually your blue pathway activating. So we can get a sense, you know, we call it the frozen mode, but it's not frozen, probably isn't a good term, because a lot of us are on this pathway as we're going about our daily lives. And that's when we start to feel like we're going through the motions, but we're not really present, right? And we might start to have feelings around that. We can, quote, disappear into a state of not knowing, not feeling, and not being. And very, very important to avoid this state as well. So this is what we think of as shutting down, the physical signs. The eyes will be glazed, usually avoiding eye contact, the general feeling that this kiddo isn't alert, they can't focus. They might look at things more than they look at people because, again, we're off the social engagement track. We're not on the green, we're 2 down into the blue. And people tend to be dangerous to a brain that is on this pathway, even people that we know, even people that we love. The person might seem tired. We might be tired, move slowly or be very slow to get moving. Our face might be flat, or their face might be flat or blank. They might look sad. When we can get them to speak, they might sound cold or too quiet or too sad or sad. Their body, instead of being rigid and stiff, it will be more slumped and slouching. They're not going to necessarily show a lot of willingness or desire to play or ability to play, or very much curiosity. There might be something that makes a noise that their brain doesn't even attend to. So they're not necessarily aware of all that's going on. They might wander around in certain settings or appear frozen. So they can look overwhelmed or uninterested in what's going on. So those are kind of the major brain states that we're talking about today when it comes to dysregulation. And so those colors, I just want to mention, they come from Dr. Delahook's book, so green, blue, and red. I do not encourage you to use those colors when talking to your children, right? And that's because a lot of our approaches so far, there's the zones of regulation that a lot of schools use and a lot of therapists might use. And there's this idea that certain colors are better. Like you want to be on green, you don't want to be on red. And that's not what we're trying to do here. We're just talking about the reality. There is no judgment on whether or not somebody's on the green, the red, or the blue. It is a reality of how our brains actually work. Our brains also, by the way, have mixed states. There's times when both the red and the blue are activated, or the red and the green, and there's also times when the blue and the green are activated. So it's not as cut and dry as I described it, but by looking for those, especially those physical signs, we can get a sense of where is my kid at, and that will help us to determine what they need from us in order to co-regulate and get back on the green pathway. So then we have this concept called neuroception, right? An unsafe neuroception. So red, blue, green applies to everybody, even the neurotypical people. But neuroception is something that is going to be very applicable for kids who've been adopted, who are in foster care. And that is one of the reasons why they might be frequently on the red pathway, or for some of them, constantly on the red pathway. For some of these kids, their default is the red or the blue pathway. It is not the green, because you have to be taught over time how to be on the green. The adults in your life have to co-regulate with you. And if you did not get that for whatever reason in the early years of life, or if it was inconsistent, or there was a lot of other trauma going on, that's when you get kids who are perpetually on a non-green pathway. So let's talk about a little bit of what neuroception is. Our brains, our subconscious brains, out of our control, are continually assessing our safety. And so they're developed in utero and used as soon as we are born, again, out of our direct control. In the first days, weeks, and months of life, our brain, through neuroception, is learning information about the environment and about life, and it's picking up on what is safe and what is not safe. And there are certain things that trigger a baby into feeling safe and into feeling unsafe. So if we have, as a baby, safety and connection with adults, that's going to train our neuroception in a certain direction, right? We're going to essentially view adults as safe. We're going to essentially feel safe unless there's an actual danger. But if we have had stress and trauma, the concept of neuroception for our brain, what it views, what the subconscious brain views as dangerous and not dangerous, gets muddied, right? And so adults, regardless of who they are, interactions, certain body sensations might start to be interpreted by the brain as actual danger that you need to survive from. Even if it's not life-threatening, neuroception doesn't necessarily do a lot of degrees. It's figuring out what is safe and what is not. And so in addition to putting us on different pathways, our neuroception and how safe we felt as an infant has a direct impact on how we develop through our developmental stages as a kid, with or without neurodivergence also being a factor in that. So in other words, you can have a kiddo who, had they not gone through trauma, would have grown up to be what we consider neurotypical, right? But because they've been through the trauma, that impacted when certain cognitive skills developed. Maybe they still develop, but they're delayed, and they're developed maybe in a context of stress or unreasonable expectation. So neuroception is one of the critical concepts in polyvagal theory. In other words, neuroception is our bottom brain's sense of safety to the environment that we're in at any given moment, and it's constantly making this multiple times per second. There's a mechanism within our brain just determining is there safety right now. So to the environment that we're in, to the situations that we're engaged in, and to people that we encounter. Our brain is doing calculations on all that stuff, and we're not consciously aware of it. Consciously being our executive functioning is not aware of it, nor can we just kind of change it very easily. So We're going to look at safe neuroception. Anytime somebody is experiencing safe neuroception, both in the moment, at any given moment, as well as ongoing in their life. So if they have a lot of safe neuroception, what does that mean for the bigger picture? And then we're going to do the same for unsafe neuroception. So in the moment, we can interact warmly with others, because safe neuroception will tend to mean that we're on the green pathway. We're going to see more green pathway signs, such as our bodies will feel relaxed and calm. We'll be able to co-regulate with others when things go wrong. That's really important for us to remember. When our kiddo is escalated and we rush in and try to do something, we try to talk to them or give them a hug, and they push back and they fight back and they get angrier, that's a sign that we're stepping in a little too soon, because their neuroception is not able to accept a social interaction, which is what that is in that moment. So when we're feeling that, we can co-regulate with others when things start to go wrong. And this is when we can learn. Very important for us to understand, if we send a kid who's maybe already on the red pathway into a school, and they're on the red pathway, even at low levels, even if they're holding it together, if they're on the red pathway, they're not learning very much and very effectively. And so first, in my opinion, for many of my clients, academics at school has to take a back seat to getting this kid's subconscious brain to feel safe in the building, while they're at school, while they're walking the halls, while they're on the playground, and while they're interacting with teachers. If that doesn't happen and they're in a constant state of red pathway, they're not going to be able to learn. If we have a good amount of safe neuroception, and it's a good thing to have unsafe neuroception when you're actually in danger, right? But if we're feeling safe in the big picture, we were able to move through our developmental processes most of the time. We're able to eventually use top-down thinking processes. So we can start to, as we get older, usually into adulthood, we can think a little bit about things and move ourselves, unless we've been through a lot, move ourselves into a more regulated place. So, you do it all the time with your kid. Your kid will say something that you think is rude or whatever. You might have a little reaction, but then you think something to yourself, okay, they're hungry, they're tired, maybe I shouldn't have said that. You'll do a little thought that actually helps you to stay more regulated. So that's you using your top-down executive function, advanced thinking processes to help move the regulation within yourself a little bit. And from this, that we start to build our own personal coping skills that we have to use intentionally. Any moment, so again, we're going to look at unsafe neuroception in any given moment, as well as if it's continually happening in somebody's life. We're going to be defensive. Our body will feel anxious or scared. Our autonomic system will activate the red or the blue pathway, both of which are defensive states. That's in response to our brain sensing there's something unsafe. We will resist interaction with others and reject connection if somebody tries to connect with us. We cannot use our executive functioning skills very well, especially as we get more and more deep onto the red pathway. And this is when, and this is a big part of it, when the challenging behaviors, the hitting, the screaming, the being mean, the rudeness, the self-injury, the running away, if it's within the context of dysregulation, which it is 90+% of the time, this is when we engage in a challenging behavior. This is applicable to kids who've been adopted because they have likely experienced a lot of unsafe neuroception. So even if they've lived with you for years and they know that you're safe, a lot of parents say, my kid knows that they're safe. It's not about what they know consciously. This is subconscious, and it was learned in the early hours, days, weeks, and months of life, maybe even years for some kids who've been through a lot. So when you've had unsafe neuroception, correctly or not, your brain is in a state of defense. And in the bigger picture, it's going to have that impact on our development. People tend to struggle with relationships. They cannot keep friends necessarily, or they struggle with the interactions themselves. Cognitive skill development is likely going to be delayed because the brain is focused on survival, not on developing cognitive skills. We're going to have ongoing challenging behaviors with few, if any, coping skills. So a lot of big escalations, maybe a lot of crises. And we can't talk about our behaviors abstractly. So this is why for a lot of my clients, we put them in therapy trying to talk about coping skills and their thoughts, but that's not what we should be talking about. They are internally dysregulated, and you have to have a completely different approach that takes a lot more time typically, and that is body focused and sensory focused before it is feeling focused and coping skill focused. And we know that early childhood stress and trauma creates unsafe neuroception. Now, there is a term called faulty neuroception, and I don't use the term faulty neuroception. So what I say is unsafe neuroception. Again, it's okay to have unsafe neuroception if there's actually a danger, but that's not what we're talking about in this training. We're talking about kids who feel unsafe neuroception when there is no actual danger, but it's doing that because of the experience that they have been through, often because of disruption in their relationships and co-regulation abilities with adults. So our bottom brain structures will recognize sensory cues in the environments and have memories, implicit, non-conscious memories, dual coded. And this creates physiological body responses, subconscious responses, and defensive responses. And so that's what the red and the blue pathways are. Our brain responds the same way to these situations as if it would when there is actual danger. So fight, flight, shutting down, and there are a few other responses that happen. So what are some examples of things, at least in my clients, that seem to trigger unsafe, faulty neuroception? So again, their brain is sensing danger when there is no actual danger from everybody else's perspective. Well, difficult is that sometimes this can be a body sensation. So even if the kiddo, if they had early medical issues, if they were born premature, if they were hospitalized, if they were put on a breathing machine, if they had some kind of surgery very early on, those are dual coded memories, right? And so a stomach grumbling, a sensation in the chest, a twinge in the head, whatever that might be for some of these kids, if it's related to their past in a negative way, that can trigger them onto the red or blue pathway, right? And they might even hold it together for a while. So we don't even necessarily know, unless we're really attuned and looking at the signs, that something has changed. So body sensations, sensory information like smells, hearing certain voice tones, very important that all the adults in a child's life are aware of their voice tone. Men need to be, or people with lower voices, I guess, generally need to be aware. So for me, if I'm kind of more naturally in this lower voice tone, when I'm working with a kiddo, I'm going to need to raise my tone a little bit, right? And it's going to sound a little fake, at least to me, but that might actually be what works a little bit better for kids. Or at the very least, in the moments where I forget or I'm not mindful, and even if I'm being friendly, but I have a big bellowy voice, I might need to be looking at my kid to see, did that just trigger them a little bit, and quickly do something to get them back onto the green pathway. Familiar physical environment. So much like PTSD, unsafe neuroception can be triggered by things seeming familiar to previous perceived danger. It could be language, certain words or phrases that they either think of, that they use, or that they hear other people using. Types of people. Some kids might be very sensitive around men, tall people, people with beards, right? It just depends on what they've been through. And we can get to a point with a lot of these kids where it appears as if stress of any type triggers them into unsafe neuroception, and therefore they go onto the red pathway. This is, a list of the ACEs, the traumatic things that many kids have been through. And these are likely going to lead to some kind of unsafe neuroceptive response even later in life when it's no longer happening. There are things that can be going on. We have the things that we know about, neglect, abuse of various different kinds, homelessness. But also I want to just point out for the kids who maybe were adopted very early on, but they had medical issues. Maybe they are neurodivergent and there's been some stress or a lot of stress at school because of how their brain works compared to what is expected of them. Maybe they've had sensory dysregulation that's created a stress for them. If it is not addressed, relatively quickly, that could lead to unsafe neuroception later on in life. So what are some clues that the kiddo you're thinking about tonight is dealing with unsafe neuroception, right? That is leading them into dysregulation. Well, have they experienced, even if they're not now, have they ever experienced continual sensory dysregulation? Are they frequently oppositional to our requests? Are they easily reactive to us or to certain people, or maybe to certain situations? Do they escalate? Do they get mad multiple times per day? It's normal to get mad every other day for young children, even once a day. But when we're doing it 5, 6, 7 times a day and we're getting older, that's a sign of unsafe neuroception. Opposite of escalating, we have the freezing shutdown. So do they go on the blue pathway or shut down frequently? Do they overreact to small stressors and generally have no coping skills? Do they reject our reasoning and comfort in the moment? These are all signs that unsafe neuroception is at play. And when we start to understand the neuroscience of a lot of these behaviors and responses, we can really start to look at some of the diagnoses, especially these that are given to foster kids. And I've been working with foster kids since the beginning of my career, seen a lot of these diagnoses. Most of these do not address the underlying brain things that are going on. They look at surface level behavior. And then there's this label as reactive attachment is given to this person and it takes us a lot of times in an unhelpful direction. So reactive attachment, I'm not saying it's never applicable, but a lot of parents, they hear that diagnosis. And so the natural response is, how do we improve the attachment? But maybe what needs to happen is we need to improve the unsafe neuroception, which includes co-regulation with a parent, right? There's the attachment is very much a part of that. But I think a lot of parents, they get that and they think my kid isn't attached to me, when it's very clear your kid is attached to you. They're just easily dysregulated. And when they get dysregulated, they resist that attachment, which is what we would expect. So it's always good, I think, to ask ourselves, which of these diagnoses might actually be better explained, at least temporarily, shifting our focus to neuroception and dysregulation. So if we suspect that unsafe neuroception is a factor, we definitely want a qualified mental health professional to be working with us in some capacity, and just have their eyes on the situation to help us keep the mental health element in mind. We want to figure out where our child is at developmentally and what our expectations are of them. This is discussed in Beyond Behaviors by Dr. Mona Delahook, so she'll go into that and help you figure that out. We want to determine and be very clear about of all the symptoms that I listed, on the red pathway, blue pathway, green pathway, pull the ones out that apply. So have like a little short list without all the extra ones that don't apply, and be very clear about not only your child, but your own responses. So for me, when I start to go on the red pathway, my heart beats, right? My face gets hot. Like I said before, I get a little mouthy. I like to kind of say my piece. And so the benefit of doing that and being aware of the body sensations, at least for me, and I'm somebody who is neurodivergent, I am now better aware of those physical responses before I'm even consciously aware of my emotion. So before I even know I'm mad, I can feel my body responding. I mean, I don't want to say this is true for everybody, but for me, that has been very, very helpful, because now I know, for example, if I'm in a meeting that's going in the tense direction, or even if it's not, but there's something about what's being talked about that's triggering me. And for me, that's a lot of school meetings that I'm in. So when school is not going well and I'm in a meeting, I've had bad experiences in school meetings as a professional. And sometimes I can, we're in the early parts of the meeting, I can feel my heartbeat. I'm like, oh, I'm having essentially a trauma response, an unsafe neuroceptive response to what's going on in this meeting. So then I can focus on my coping skills, take some deep breaths, make sure I don't speak until I'm no longer ultra aware of my heart beating. I feel a little bit cooler. And that's one way that I, as an adult who's neurodivergent, can use this information to help me. So the same thing can be true for you. Once you realize you're on the red pathway, trying to put something in place that allows you to regulate a little bit before you engage with your child is going to be really important. So we want to determine how they and us respond when feeling unsafe neuroception. We also want to determine individualized triggers. So again, a lot of the triggers will be internal. We won't see them, but there are many times very well-known triggers that might be triggering it. So being told no for a lot of kids triggers escalation. And if unsafe neuroception is an obvious part of their life, it is reasonable to assume that being told no triggers their brain into an unsafe neuroceptive state. Unexpected changes to certain things, transitioning from, off of screen time, all of these things that we look at as triggers to behaviors, we also want to remember they could be triggering literal unsafety, lack of safety in the brain, which is why this kid is having such a big response to going to bed, even though they go to bed every single night. Come on, right? We want to be both proactive and respond to triggers in a developmentally appropriate way. So realizing that kids can't just turn it off. They can't just comply, especially the kids that we're talking about tonight. That's not developmentally appropriate. And so it's unfair to put them in those kinds of situations, or to have those expectations that they just need to be quiet because I'm the adult and they're the kid. That's not how this works at all. I'm sure most of you know that at this point. We want to prioritize safety and connection in a developmentally appropriate way, which I'll continue to talk to you about. And we want to discover soothing sensory supports. And hopefully you've already started that particular step. But I tend to find that there's a little bit more exploration we can do. And Dr. Mona Delahook's book really does great at all of these and helping you kind of figure out and write out and list some of these things. This idea that human beings need to feel safe in order to make use of their thinking brain, so in order to use their skills, is a common denominator in the field of neuroscience, and it has been for a long time. So when kids are feeling lack of safety, they literally cannot use their strengths as well because their brain is preventing them from doing so. So if you have a kid who is stressed or dysregulated frequently, daily, this to me is kind of the way forward. We got to focus on our connection with them. Then we got to develop some good co-regulation with them. We want to then look into sensory supports and using those sensory supports both proactively and after escalation starts. And then also cognitive supports both proactively and after escalation starts. And cognitive supports are the concepts that I might bring to the table that are keeping the specific brain processes in mind when there's dysregulation. So we want to prioritize connection. And so what this means practically from the clients that come to me in my work, what I'm telling the adults in their life is that every adult who has authority, so teachers, both parents, you all need to be prioritizing connection time. And you need to have daily connection with them, right? If you're a therapist and you see them once a week, you would obviously be having weekly connection time, but essentially every day that you're interacting with this kid, you need to be having some kind of connection time with them. And this really needs to be one-on-one, especially at first, and especially in the tough cases, it needs to be one-on-one. If there's a bunch of kids around, there's so many factors there that might make that situation trigger unsafe neuroception that we want to reduce that and make it one-on-one. I realize that you're busy, so this doesn't have to be 30 minutes every day necessarily, even 5 minutes, and if you have multiple kids, right, you have to maybe do several minutes and structure it for yourself, put it on your calendar, and think ahead so that way when you're doing this, you're actually in the moment and you're looking for the signs of co-regulation, because that's what we're doing with connection, is we're building co-regulation between ourselves. And so what this connection time needs to be is easy. So if you were to play a game and you both get competitive, that actually is fine a little bit later on, but if it's creating dysregulation and a problem, we don't want to do that. people might think that the 5 minutes should just be a conversation. Not necessarily. It doesn't need to be talking about school, especially if when we tend to ask them those questions, that creates dysregulation. So we want to be avoiding things that are going to trigger dysregulation or unsafe neuroception. So what does that mean then? What can we do? Maybe sensory activity. So brushing hair, rubbing their back if that's something that they like, cuddling if that's appropriate, reading together, even just for 5 minutes can be a good connection time activity, because the goal here is that you are both in a brain state on the green pathway and of co-regulation. It's not what you're talking about or doing. It is about the signals that both of your brains are sending back and forth. We want our brains to send what we call cues of safety. And what this means is that not only will you be sending them cues of safety, but they will be sending you cues of safety. And that's when you start to feel warm. That's when you have a little moment and you smile with each other. Those kind of nice swelling feelings are what you want. When you have a moment with somebody, that's a good sign that you're in a safe, neuroceptive, co-regulated state with each other. And so I also want you to think about that, you might have a great connection time, right? You spend 5, 10, 15 minutes with them, you have a really soothed, good moment, and then the rest of the day is just a dysregulated disaster. That does not mean that the connection time you had was for nothing, because this connection time is not meant to have any immediate impacts. It might, but probably not. It is just to get some time where you are in that co-regulated state for each other and building that up over a long period of time. And so successful time in this neuroceptive safety together helps to develop what we call co-regulation. And that will pave the way for collaboration or problem solving that will allow us to be proactive. And over time, hopefully, the goal is that when things are struggling, that they'll actually be more receptive to your attempts to co-regulate. So right now, you might try to give them a hug or to do something soothing when they're angry, and they get more angry. The idea of doing this over time is that you start to notice that they're more receptive to you. So the escalation might last a shorter amount of time, where they're able to connect with you a little bit sooner than they were able to a few months ago. So that's the structure that this is hopefully leading you to. I'm going to skip some slides here just for the sake of time and flow. This slide just talks about, and again, you'll have access to the slides, but this just talks about the theorized developmental levels that kids need to go through. Dr. Mona Delahooke also discusses it, but we'll see in the very first box, the first developmental stage has pretty much everything to do with safety and soothing with adults. And many kids who've been adopted or who are in foster care, this was disruptive and never really fully fleshed out, even as their brain continued to develop maybe in other ways. So a lot of kids that I've worked with in foster care, they deal with a lot of reactivity and perceived danger as adults try to interact with them. And that only becomes more applicable when the adults are adding expectations, pressuring them, or demanding things of them. And that's when we get a lot of reactivity and negative responses. So just to summarize, the green pathway is a system of safety and connection. The red pathway is a system of mobilization, mobilizing the body, preparing it for survival, which is fight or flight. And then the blue pathway is a system of immobilization, to shut down our body, because theoretically that will increase our chances of survival in certain situations. So all of these evolve to help with survival, and all of these are autonomic, subconscious states. We can't just choose to go from one pathway to another. I mentioned before that there are mixed states. I'll just leave those on the slides for you to reference later. So we always, and this is kind of just me reviewing a little bit, but we always want to be monitoring, what pathway is my child on right now? And it's hard because we are often so focused on the behaviors we're seeing, we're not looking for their vibe or for their neuroception. So that could be something that you focus on for a couple of weeks, is just when you encounter your child, before engaging, before saying anything, assess, give yourself a second to look for the signs. Are they happy? Are they on the red pathway? Or are they on the blue pathway? And again, when we're using terms like safety, and especially like in the context of kids who've been in foster care or who are adopted, we often think that telling them that they're safe is important. And I'm not saying that it's not important, but that might be important to their conscious brain, their executive functioning, but it's not going to do anything immediately for the subconscious brain if they're already starting to go on the red pathway. We have to demonstrate to that part of their brain by letting time pass and by adjusting certain things like what we're doing or what's going on in the environment. We have to demonstrate and give that part of the brain time to go back to the green pathway. All right. Cool. So before I give you kind of a framework of how to respond to dysregulation and escalation, I just want to give some practical supports that are specifically meant for unsafe neuroception, because not all dysregulation is necessarily because of unsafe neuroception, but if you've been adopted, there's a very good chance that unsafe neuroception is playing a role, even if it doesn't seem that way on the surface. So we always want to think about our faces and our voices. Again, the green pathway makes us very attuned as humans to the facial muscles and to what's going on in the tones and pitches of people's voice. So as often as possible, we want to use a soft and warm tone, even if it takes effort. And what this means is that we might need to stop and think before talking. So if my kid asks me a question and I'm kind of, distracted or whatever, I just immediately answer. It might be better if before I answer, I have some kind of recognition that, oh, I need to say this in a really soft and warm way, or with a raised pitch a little bit. And that will take some practice for some of us. We generally want to speak slowly and model thinking. So even if they ask us a question, we could answer it right away, but we could also sit there and have like a thoughtful look on our face, right? This is a little exaggerated for the camera, like, what's going on? But we're showing that it's okay before we respond to something to think. And we want our eyes to be warm and to be expressive, to keep them on the green pathway. Our bodies and our body positioning is also very important. Definitely, even when things are going well, if the kiddo that you are supporting is known to have unsafe neuroception because they've been through some stuff, be very aware of how you're standing. It's those everyday moments, like where we're just kind of moving quickly as the adults, that we are potentially starting to put them on another pathway, and we don't know it and they don't know it, but then they trigger over something a few minutes later, and that's what we're focused on. So definitely avoid standing over them. Move your body slowly when you're around them. Give space when needed, physical space when they need, and then also be attuned to when do they need physical affection from me. And especially kids who've been through stuff, who've been adopted, who are in foster care, it is inconsistent, and it will be very hard to tell. And they might blame us for not, for either getting in their space or not giving us, not comforting them enough. It will seem like we can't necessarily do the right thing in a lot of these situations, and that's fine. That's how these situations are. But this is the balance of not overloading them with our presence when they're dysregulated, but also observing and waiting for when they're receptive to affection or problem solving or whatever it might be, some kind of comfort from us. Lean back when you're talking to them and keep engaged and keep looking at them, unless looking at them is triggering for them specifically, which it is for some people. But when we're on the green pathway, you're usually good to go. And then we also want to be aware of our demands and how our demands as kids impact their neuroception. So especially when things have already started to escalate, or when they're going into the frozen shutdown state, we want to focus on soothing first and talking later. So if there was an incident at school, they get in the car with you and you already know about the incident, your impulse might be to start talking about it immediately, but don't. Get them in the car, get a reading based on their body and other cues of what pathway they're on, and focus on soothing, focus on comforting, getting them into a safe, co-regulated place with you, and then maybe talking about the specifics of whatever happened later. We want to avoid too much verbal, especially if the person is neurodivergent. and by verbal, we mean verbal language. We as adults, we tend to overload most kids with verbal thoughts on things. We say things multiple times frequently, and maybe we should be visualizing things or allowing for more time to think between whatever it is that we are saying. We want to adjust expectations during dysregulation, and this is a hard one for a lot of us. They might be refusing to get off the computer right away because it's time for bed, and now there's a big escalation. It might be best for you just to leave it alone that night. So you can stop the immediate dysregulating issue, which is engaging over that. You let them stay on the computer. And the idea isn't that you're letting them get away with something. It's that you're handling the regulation element of the situation. And then that we're exploring proactive things to deal with staying on the computer too long in the future. If it helps kids, we want to give them one-on-one help. This is also hard for a lot of people because we think that we should be teaching kids to do things on their own. And so, my question is, if you were to fold their laundry with them instead of expecting them to do it, would that maintain regulation and would it actually get the thing done? And if the answer is yes, I'm going to encourage you to do that for a while, for a long while, right? You can work on independence a little bit later, but our help is very supportive of many cognitive skills, which lowers demands. And this is the demands part of unsafe neuroception. So, emotional regulation. If we are feeling emotionally regulated, so we're on the green pathway, there's different things that could be going on. We're either just internally regulated, so our subconscious is feeling safe and it's feeling soothed. We're on the green pathway. It's an internal physiological thing. It also could be that we're maintaining our emotional regulation through some kind of behavior. So there might be sensory behaviors going on when especially if you're neurodivergent, you might start fidgeting a little bit more when you're encountering stress, even low levels of stress. So they might rock back and forth. They might do something with their hands, all those, a lot of sensory behaviors that could be going on. A lot of verbal behaviors might be going on that's unconscious, but it's actually being done by the brain and body to stay regulated at lower levels of stress typically. Then there's the more advanced one, which is what we talked about, that top-down thinking, consciously regulating, holding it together. And it won't necessarily feel like you're calming yourself down. You just might be holding something in from getting out of control, right? You still might feel very dysregulated. And that's a big problem with a lot of cognitive emotional regulation. It doesn't necessarily achieve true green pathway regulation. It just prevents certain behaviors from happening, or it gives the impression to others that we're regulated, even if we're not. I'm going to move on just because we're running a little bit out of time into the actual strategies here. This little bit. So when situations happen, one of the things that you're going to see I'm going to recommend is that you avoid talking too much. And this is because right now, the person either needs to soothe and go back onto the green pathway, or they need to use their executive functioning skills to think through and to start to regulate themselves, to self-regulate. And when we talk, we're actually demanding multiple parts of the deeper brain to do stuff. And so speaking in these situations is a demand, right? Sometimes the kiddo will scream at you, "Stop talking to me," and other times they won't. If somebody is screaming to you, if they're in a meltdown and they are screaming to you to stop talking, please stop talking. You're not going to want to. You're going to want to keep on going. You're going to want to get them to comply in that moment, but that's a sign that you are dysregulated, right? Talking is not good for most people in the high levels of escalation. Talking also, even if we're being nice, talking invites a response, an opposition at a time where we don't want them to be responding. We want them to be regulating, hopefully. And so talking, in other words, engages too many cognitive demands that can cause more escalation. So what do we do? What's a starting place that we can start with when our child has become dysregulated? Well, the first thing to do is to stop, take a breath, because taking a breath, A, is good for self-regulation, hopefully back onto the green pathway. And it also buys you a couple of seconds to use whatever executive functioning you have to think through, how am I going to deal with this, right? So think about your brain. Ask yourself, am I dysregulated right now, right? And the answer to that will determine how you move forward. You want to resist impulsively answering. They might ask you questions or be demanding information from you that you have immediate answers to. Don't answer right away. Again, take some time to think and make the assessment. Should I talk right now? Sometimes you'll need to talk. I'm not saying be quiet. I'm not saying ignore. I'm saying do not allow the talking that you do to be pulled from you by the impulsivity of the situation. We also want to remember and have a little bit of a thought of, there's something wrong here. This looks like intentional disrespect. It looks like if she wanted to turn off the screen and go to bed, she could, if she just chose to do it. It looks like this is about a choice that this kid can make, and they're making the wrong choice, but it's not. They're dysregulated. There's something going on, even if it looks like they could just stop the behavior and do what they need to do. So again, we're focused on soothing first. We start to help soothing. There's no one thing you can do. I don't have the magic words or the thing that you can do that instantly provides soothing, because it really just doesn't work that way. But we can slow things down. So again, they're saying things to us, we're saying things back not as often, and we're pausing before we respond. Where again, if we change our expectation, if that helps things get back onto the green pathway, I'm going to encourage you to do that, right? We want to provide comfort and affection and connection when we sense that they are ready for that, right? When they give some kind of indication, or when we can see that they've de-escalated a little bit, that's when we might say, hey, do you want a hug right now, or something like that. That will hopefully speed us down back to the green pathway. We want to avoid overloading with too many words. So in other words, we're waiting until we're able to move forward, instead of trying to, with our adult authority or responses, trying to get some kind of solution now. And oftentimes our solution, at least at first, is that this kid needs to comply with what I want them to do, because I'm the adult and they're the kid. That doesn't work that way with these kids. Every time, this is something I want people to remember, because some of you are dealing with kids who might be perpetually dysregulated, or they're dysregulated on the red pathway several times a day. It's exhausting, and I absolutely understand that. If the kid has been through stuff, such as many kids who've been adopted or who are in foster care, in a way, they need this dysregulation to happen. Because if we can respond in a way that helps with co-regulation, that is what paves the way to self-regulation. Right now, they don't have self-regulation. They get upset, especially in certain scenarios, and they can seem to get really, really escalated. So there's opportunity every time they get dysregulated for an adult to respond in a way that promotes co-regulation. And it is this over many, 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 many occurrences that builds the way for the brain to start self-regulating. And we'll start to see that through reduced instances of escalation, through quicker recovery, or through the kiddo actually taking a deep breath when they're escalated, and using some of those coping skills that we've been talking about proactively. I also want to encourage you not to take things too personally when things are said during escalation. Most of what is said are just defensive responses. It's not them thinking about, what do I need to say to fix the situation, and saying something really mean. So generally, or they'll sometimes even negative self statements like, I'm so stupid, or I hate you, or I don't want to be in this family, those kinds of things. They likely don't mean much in terms of what's going on. The issue is not those things, it's that they are dysregulated, and they need some kind of co-regulation in order to get back onto the green pathway. They're also not, we can ask them what's going on. They're not going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. They're not going to say, well, because of my early neglect and the abuse that I suffered before I was adopted, my brain has a different sense of what is safe and what is not. So now as I'm going out into the world, certain ways that people act or certain sounds that I hear make me more prone to escalate. And they're not going to tell you that. They're going to say, you told me I had to get off the computer, or whatever it is. They're going to be looking most likely at that surface level as well. So that's why, whatever they're saying in the middle of escalation, we want to hear, right? We want to listen to what people have to say, but it could also be missing the mark. So I call a lot of the phrases people use, like, I hate you, I don't want to be in this family, unhelpful scripts. Their brain is initiating them in a state of dysregulation, but the issue actually is not that they hate you. The issue is that they're dysregulated. It's not that they don't want to be in your family anymore. It's that they're struggling and they're dysregulated. So that's what I mean by that. And if we respond to those or try to problem solve, well, why do you hate yourself, or what is it about the family you don't like, or if we go in that direction, we're usually missing the mark. So a few other things to keep in mind. If you must talk, because some kids, if you were to just not respond to them, which is what I'm encouraging you not to immediately respond. But if you were to continually do that, that would actually create more escalation, because it's perceived maybe as a power struggle, right? Where the kiddo is needing you, they're needing something from you. So we don't want to just like be quiet, and we're definitely not ignoring, but try to only respond maybe to every third statement they have to say, right? You can also try to buy yourself some time. Say something like, I need a minute to think about this, right? You're not telling them what to do in that moment, because that's not going to work, but you're modeling what needs to happen. I need to think about what you're asking me right now. Let me take a moment, or something like that. We can model and achieve regulations. So we model it for them, but hopefully achieve it within us, because we're likely getting dysregulated ourselves, by taking time to think and taking a breath before we say anything. And not a big eye roll angry breath, but a breath that is showing, I'm trying to stay regulated for you right now. An escalation plan is essentially the plans that you likely have already made with your child, and that other professionals might do, but like, what do you do when you get upset kind of plan? And what we want to remember about those agreements and the idea of giving the kid a list of coping skills is that is cognitively advanced, and it's going to miss the point if ultimately their issue is that they never developed good co-regulation with adults, because that was disrupted in early childhood. So remember, that's advanced and not the place that you should be starting. And again, they have to be developmentally ready and willing to have the conversation. And you have to have some kind of collaboration, or what I call the planning together model, to develop some kind of plan. But they can definitely be helpful. And your kid right now, like, they actually might be pretty well engaged with some kind of plan. It may not always get followed, but you might be there with your kid. So just, if you do have an escalation plan, or whatever you want to call it with them, make sure that you're practicing those plans. Don't just talk about what you should do, but actually practice it when everybody's on the green pathway and doing well. Get those, if their plan is to go take some space in their bedroom, have them go, have a little situation where you say, let's pretend that we're upset right now. Have them walk to their bedroom if they're willing, and take some deep breaths, or draw, or turn on the music, even if it's just for a sec. Get that physical practice going. One of my clients, our strategy for him was to walk around the block. So the proactive practice was, we would say, hey, let's practice the plan. And this was only for a few weeks. We didn't always do this, but just to get this plan into his brain, into our brain, we said, hey, we're going to practice the plan. He would get up and he would do a quick walk around the block, right? So you're getting that physical practice in. We also want, if we do come up with these plans, to be consistent among settings and caregivers. So if we're able to allow our kid to take some alone time in their room, and that is helpful for them at home, the question is, how do we translate that kind of thing to school? How can we get them into a separate area following a plan where they're going to be able to do the same things that will hopefully get them back on the green pathway and back into the classroom? Our goal when we are responding to escalation is not to teach a lesson. A lot of us might feel like it needs to be. In fact, we are uncomfortable if there's not some kind of lesson or acknowledgement from the child that they did something wrong, or that things should have gone differently. But I'm going to argue that that is not the goal. The goal is to move back onto the green pathway, and we may never talk about it again, and that's okay. Right? Because the skill being taught here is the co-regulation and eventually the self-regulation, not the fact that they can avoid these behaviors at this point in their life. And remember not to respond to immediate opposition. Okay, so we're at the end of our time. I went a little bit over, but I do want to make sure that I open it up for those of you who are here live. If there's any questions, I hope that was helpful and a good starting place for you. And thanks for having me.
Oh, Nate, that was wonderful. So helpful. I got a lot out of that myself, and also some things we know, but that we need reminders or that we can't retrieve in the moment. So thank you very much. We do have some questions for you. The first one is DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, effective unsafe neuroception?
No, it is not.
Okay.
Simply put.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to let you keep that answer short because we have more questions. Do you have any tips specifically for co-regulating with teens?
It's trickier, it's imperfecter, and I think that it has to be really individualized. So like that 5-minute connection time I was talking about, what is this teenager willing to do? I always start with the sensory, which not everybody's comfortable with, but like for me, I like having my back rubbed. A lot of people like having their back rubbed. And even if I'm kind of grumpy and if I'm a teenager, if I like that sensory input, a parent can just walk up to me and silently do that. And even if I'm a little annoyed, I might still let it happen because it's a sensory input that I like. So whether it's a back rub or some other sensory input, would they be willing to do that? So then there's that physical connection. That just won't work though for some people, either because of trauma or who they are. They don't want to be touched, or they're just not that kind of person, or you're not that kind of person. That can happen too. So, is there a funny video you can watch together on YouTube, right? Or something educational and quick on YouTube, just spending that time in a co-regulated state. For some people, having like a one-on-one meal together might be a pretty good. There's still a lot of factors that could be triggering stress in that situation, but also it could be we can't always make things completely stress-free. So exploring what is soothing for this teenager, or what is easy, and how can I engage them, even if and that's why it might need to be short. It might need to be 5 minutes, because that's not because you're busy, because that's their tolerance level for you right now, and that's fine.
Thank you. Okay, this one's a little longer. Do you use the same steps for children that are neurodivergent, and they put in brackets FASD, kids that can't tell you what they want, how they feel, how their day was? Our kids have FASD and extreme sensory issues. This might be a whole different training. My gut instinct is no, it wouldn't be a different training, I think.
No.
But I'll let you.
This was all of this was developed with FASD in mind, and then I did some adjustments for you all today. But my whole work is surrounding FASD. So yes, this is the approach I would be recommending, pretty much.
I wholeheartedly agree. As someone who works and lives in that life, I think it is bang on. Let me see, there was another one here. Well, a number of people have asked whether they can access the slides, and I think you said that you could share a PDF. Is that right, Nate?
Yes, they are on my website right now. Let me go back to that slide at the very beginning. Hold on one sec, sorry.
And while you're finding that, I'll just share, we have recorded today's session, and next week we'll be posting it on Adopt for Life's public YouTube channel, and it will be there for 6 months. And there you go. There's the link. So if you go to the website, you'll be able to get the slides there. We have one more question for you, Nate. Have you received, or do you recommend, or have you used optimal neurofeedback to assist with dysregulation?
Have I used it? No, but I have heard from many clients who have, and I have somewhat of an understanding of what it is. And I would say the results are pretty mixed, especially amongst the neurodivergent people. So part of me, because it's so brain-based, loves it and wants it to be like a solution. And And there are, in addition to neurofeedback, there's like other kind of tech options, like the safe and sound protocol that can be used for people who might have unsafe neuroception due to certain sound sensitivities. But again, even amongst them, there's mixed. And I'm working in the fetal alcohol neurodivergent world. So I would say when that should be a point that you're getting to kind of later in the process. But if they're still stressed out at school because school has ultimately unreasonable expectations or a lack of understanding about what this kid has been through, that's probably not going to be particularly helpful. Same thing in the home. We really have to make sure that we are taking a brain-based approach in every area of life that we're putting this kid in, before we kind of take the risk, as it were, for something like that. And when I say there's mixed results, I mean, some people have immediate, fantastic, less sensitivity to things, so they're more regulated, but also people have left more sensitive and more dysregulated, which is obviously not what you're wanting when you're doing that kind of stuff.
Right. And we're getting some lovely comments. I hope you're seeing in the chat. Thanking you, Nate. So on behalf of Adopt for Life, what we all would like to thank you so much for joining us tonight, Nate, and sharing with us. And I'm going to watch it again once it's up on YouTube, because there were just so many wonderful ideas in there. So thank you, Catherine, for assisting us, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Good night.
Thank you.